Shout out to Central Computers. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Adrian here for Digital Dojos. Today we're going to be unboxing, setting up, and taking a look at the all-new Raspberry Pi 5 and some accessories. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with a Raspberry Pi, it is a computer, a small form factor computer that was introduced years ago. These Pi series of computers are these small single board computers, small form factor. They were meant to be affordable, cost effective, that were meant more as like a learning platform and a do-it-yourself computer to allow people to teach them about the basics of computer science. So using this and programming it or using it in creative projects. And over time, these things have evolved. They've gone more powerful and they've been used in so many different projects. So at a base level, you can use it to run a basic, Linux operating system and be a full-fledged desktop at that. You can get more advanced and turn these into all sorts of servers. You can use these as projects like a Pi-hole to block ads across your network. You can use it as a makeshift router. You can use it to host a Minecraft server, and you can go as far as integrating this with different things. Like, for example, a project I'm looking forward to doing is using this to modify things like a arcade machine or run emulators. There's just so many possibilities with this. And this is the latest edition, the Raspberry Pi 5. So as I talk a bit here, we're going to go ahead and switch camera angles. So we're going to go ahead and look to unbox this here. This just came out recently in the month of October, late October specifically. The Pi 5 features all sorts of new hardware. This is featuring, you can see the kind of spec sheet here on the back, the A76 Cortex processor. That's a quad-core processor, 64-bit, 8 gigabytes of RAM. I believe it comes in a 4 gigabyte model as well. And I think it even comes in even smaller variants. Obviously, the lower in RAM you go, the cheaper it is. All new ports. You have now USB 3.0 ports on here. You have 2 micro HDMI ports, which allow for 4K up to 60 frames there. So 4K resolution. And then you have all sorts of other ports and capabilities. Bluetooth 5.0, gigabit Ethernet, support for 802.11b, GN, and AC wireless. The list kind of goes on there. So this is definitely much more powerful than the previous Pi 4. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and start to unbox it as I talk a little bit about this. Here in the box, here we have it, the Raspberry Pi itself. It looks like just a motherboard at that. It's essentially just, again, a single board computer here with a lot of the new chips and stuff that we're going to see here to take advantage of, all the new hardware and kind of expandability. You'll see a bunch of open ports and different things you can hook up here. I believe you can even hook up like NVMe drives and things of that nature and kind of PCI expansion. I believe you can hook up a full-blown GPU to this. So I'm really excited to kind of push this to its paces and test out a bunch of cool stuff. So again, let's go ahead and take a look at the ports here. On the front here, you have 2 USB 2.0 ports and then 2 USB 3.0 ports. So 4 USB ports on this small board that you can get a lot of throughput from. You have the gigabit Ethernet there to connect to hardwire, and or you can again use Wi-Fi. On the I/O side, you have the 2 mini HDMI ports, so you will need either a mini HDMI to standard HDMI and or an adapter of some sort, which is what I bought. You have a USB-C, I believe this is PD, so this can do power delivery, so you have that USB-C port here. Speaking of which, you now have a power button right there, so this power button is there and finally on a Raspberry Pi, which is nice to make it easy. Typically they're sold like with the power supply and whatnot. Speaking of power supply, I do want to mention something really quickly. This is not the standard Raspberry Pi power supply you would get with a Pi 5. In fact, when you buy a Raspberry Pi, you actually don't typically get a power supply. So if I go ahead and just switch back to cam here, you usually have to buy it separate or like buy it in a bundle. The Pi 5, while it can be powered by a USB-C power supply like this will work. This is actually meant for the Pi 4. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this out and show you here. This is just a Pi 4 power supply, USB-C. Now, standard, obviously, like it'll fit, it'll work, and it'll power the Raspberry Pi 5. No issue here. To get the full output in performance mode of these ports, you're going to want to use the new Pi 5 power supply. Unfortunately, I believe, at least from the research I've done right now, it seems like they've gone this kind of weird, not necessarily proprietary route. Like, obviously, you can get the Pi 5 charger. That's going to be your best bet right now, at least at release. I'm sure more third-party chargers are going to come out in the future. But it's like a hit or miss. You have to have like the very specific right type of USB-C power supply in order to get the full throughput Otherwise, you might get an error message or just not the full throughput of these USB ports. Now, I also picked up this right here. This is the Raspberry Pi official case for the Pi 5. Again, more accessories, more stuff is going to come out for these devices over time. Right now at release, obviously, it's a lot of it is those OEM parts and power supplies and whatnot. And this is just a standard Raspberry Pi case. We've seen this kind of case design before in the past, but this is, again, specifically meant for the 5. And with that, it actually has an active cooling fan built in, which is, from what I've seen from the reviews, not having tested it myself yet, obviously, is that that's definitely going to be needed, some sort of active cooling, whether you get heat sinks for passive cooling or you get something like a fan or a combination of both, depending on your setup, is nice to have. If you're doing more intensive stuff and you're going to be pushing this, the thermals will get hot on the Pi 5, so it's nice to have some sort of cooling in the case. Okay, so the fan port's right here. You're going to want to take there's like a little cover on top of that. Just pop that cap out, either with your nail or tweezers. And then you're going to go ahead and connect your fan connector and chips. And this will still allow you to have those pins available if you want to kind of hook up anything or you have any projects that you're going to be using these pins for right here. You can still have access to them with this default case. Again, more third-party cases are going to come out and have different options. For example, my Pi 4 has one that accepts like NVMe drives and all those sorts of cool stuff and kind of makes the case a little bit bigger. You'll notice here on the bottom of the board, which I didn't get to show too much of, you actually have your micro SD card slot. So this is where you'll be able to throw in your micro SD card slot that you can use to boot off of, run whatever distro of Linux you're going to run, or if you're running like something like RetroPie, essentially whatever image you're going to run, you can load it and throw it on here. If you're not going to use something like an NVMe drive, I believe this is going to be the default boot drive. All right, let's go ahead and close this case up now. So super simple install overall. Make sure everything is aligned properly. I'd say probably start with the bottom case. Falls in and click it in. And just like that, we have a Raspberry 5 assembled fully. So there's the fan. You have access to your pins like here, like I mentioned. You have this kind of transparent top, which is a nice little design. And then all your ports accessible right there. But you can also just put the cap on if you want to cover all of that up and just have it kind of fully encased in all of its glory here. Okay, so at this point, once your Pi 5 is fully set up, at least from the hardware perspective, you've thrown it in the case, you've got all your accessories that you need to power it up, power supply, so on and so forth. Really, all that's next is kind of deciding and depending on what you're going to do with it next and how you're going to use it. You're going to need your micro SD card, and you're going to go ahead and plug this into a standard computer at first, your PC, Mac, whatever it may be, and you're going to want to load a image on it based on, again, the OS that you're going to be running. And in this case, since we're installing the Raspberry Pi OS, go ahead and choose device. I'm going to say this is the Raspberry Pi 5. I'm going to choose the OS I want to get. In this case, we're going to go with the Raspberry Pi OS 64-bit. You can see you have multiple options here. This should take a couple minutes, give or take, depending on the size of your drive, the speed of it. It's going to go ahead and write the OS over to your micro SD card. Now, while that's finishing writing up, I'm just showing you the setup I have going on here. So essentially, again, you would use a micro HDMI adapter, or if you have like a micro HDMI to HDMI, I have both of those. In this case, I'm just using the adapter here. Couple things just off the bat to note. You can see here, when you're using an adapter like this, I'm actually going to move this HDMI port over. That way you space in gap, because otherwise the USB-C power here, it fits, but it's obviously right up on the power connector and it kind of doesn't sit and fully align properly, so you can see here. So that's just something I noticed right off the bat. Okay, so I got my capture card working properly. It turns out I just plugged in directly via micro HDMI to HDMI and I got a signal. So I don't know if that's the micro HDMI to HDMI adapter that's the issue. I also hooked it up to a monitor directly just to see, and I'm suspecting the cases it is the adapter. So could be a bad adapter that I got. So ideally, like I said, you'd probably just get micro HDMI to HDMI as a cable if you're going to be hooking this up to a display. Ideally, most people will probably either be remoting into this, depending on how they set it up. You can install clients like VNC and so on and so forth. But here we are in the dashboard, and you can see here, this is a full-blown desktop OS. So I'm just installing a tool here known as NeoFetch. This is going to allow me to kind of display system information here. So I can go ahead and show you the kind of specs. As you can see here, we have the Raspberry 5. It shows you information like your current uptime, resolution, and other information regarding your current system. In this case, you can see here, 2.4 gigahertz is what we're running right now at this CPU. You can overclock this. I think you can push this like 3 gigahertz and up. And then you have your memory here. So 8 gigs and the used, and you can kind of see the OS version, host name, so on and so forth. And again, for all intents and purposes, this is like a full-blown computer. You can essentially use this as a full-on desktop for, you know, a kid's PC or a project or a hobby computer that you want to hook up. We have a couple of these in the office that we use as like metric TVs because these are so low power and efficient that we can hook them up to TVs and then just remote into them to display like data and have them constantly running. But you can see here, I can just go to youtube.com and I can go ahead and have it load here. And I can click on one of my latest videos here and I can choose to watch this. And we're going to go ahead and set it to 1080p by automatic. We'll full screen it. And you can see here, like this, for all intents and purposes, can run and operate as a standard computer just fine. You can use this to do your basic web browsing, video watching, streaming in terms of content and whatnot, all via this small form factor computer. Another tool, especially for first-time users, I would recommend installing is called PyApps. PyApps is just a utility that's going to make it installing a lot of great useful programs for your Raspberry Pi more accessible. So a lot of stuff, typically you're going to have to run a terminal command, like in this case, to install PyApps, you would get this terminal command and then paste it into your terminal, run it. That's going to go ahead and install PyApps, which then will pop up here in your accessories tab if I click it. And then from here, I now have access to look at a bunch of different apps that I might want to grab for from PyApps. So for example, you can check out all of these other tools that might be worth checking out. For me, in the gaming section, I can go ahead and check out some of the emulators and other tools that they have here. And I can go back and they have all sorts of different tools for multimedia. You can see here, as well as office tools. Again, it just gives you a slew of apps, kind of like a built-in app store for you to install. And it's really great if you're just getting started with something like PyOS and you may not know the equivalent or alternative softwares for something like this. So here we have the Doom 3 demo installed. I'm going to go ahead and just run into a new game here. Obviously, Doom 3, we're not talking Crysis here, but again, you have to keep in mind what we're running it on and just kind of give you an idea, baseline at least, of what this thing can do. You can see here, for all intents and purposes, like it is running the game fine. I can move around here. Obviously, this isn't going to win anything in the graphics department, but it's running. And then I pulled up the system monitoring tool here on the side just so you can kind of see how the performance is kind of handling here as far as the CPU goes, while I'm just obviously running around here in Doom 3. So you can see the CPU spiking up here and there, but generally it's staying around 30% all in all. And then we're just going to run for initial tests here. I installed Geekbench 5 because I think Geekbench 6 requires some specific setup out of the box and have to reboot the Pi, but I just installed 5 just to get initial test scores here so you can kind of see single multi-core score. All right, and here we have it. We have the results. So if I click on this link, this should just show me our results here. Single core score 593, multi-core 1588. Again, this is just stock, not overclocked or anything like that. So 2.4 gigahertz, 8 gig model. This is Geekbench 5. Keep that in mind, not Geekbench 6. But you can see here, 593 single core score, 1588 multi-core score. If you just want to have a kind of baseline idea as far as benchmarks go. And then just to showcase, here we have PPSPP, the PSP emulator running on the Pi 5. This is just stock OpenGL, nothing configured. You can see frame rates are going to drop a little bit coming from 60 FPS when things kind of get more intensive on the screen, but for all purposes, this is definitely playable. I'm sure there are going to be scenes and levels where we'll see dips in frame rate, but For the most part, again, this is running pretty smooth, at least in the opening cutscene of the game here. And here we drop more into the kind of 40 frames per second when we got a lot going on. But again, still managing to go through the game despite the drops completely fine here. All right, and with that, ladies and gentlemen, future Adrian here, just to kind of wrap up my thoughts on the Raspberry Pi 5. I've spent the weekend with this, so I got to test it a little bit further. And my initial impressions are, it's a great piece of hardware. It's much better than the previous generation Raspberry Pi 4 with its new hardware improvements. But I think there's still obviously a lot of optimization to be done, both on the hardware and the software. And that's truly what I'm most excited for. And what I mean by that is, this is new. The Raspberry Pi 4 has been out for years. So, we still need to see a lot of the new cases, third-party accessories, so on and so forth, start to roll out for the Pi 5 since it just came out publicly to everyone. And then for the development and the community side on the software end, there's just a lot of stuff that still needs to be optimized and updated for the new architecture in the Pi 5. Again, a lot of the stuff that was working in the Pi 4, for years and years that's been out, now has to be adjusted for a lot of the new Pi 5 hardware. So even though the hardware is better in the new Pi 5, waiting to see that optimization and a lot of people get their hands on this and start updating things like emulators and so on and so forth is really what's going to unlock the full potential of this Raspberry Pi 5 as a platform. But for all intents and purposes, whether you're using it as a basic desktop computer or an emulator or a server or what have you, like this Pi 5 is going to serve you just fine. And I think to answer the question as who this may be for, anybody who's just genuinely interested in technology and tweaking things in hardware, and you've never messed around with like a single board computer like a Raspberry Pi 5, or you've never messed around with things like home servers or what have you, this is a really cheap and easy and affordable way to kind of get into that space. So consider checking it out if you haven't already. With that, a couple recommendations for the Raspberry Pi 5. Get a case, get the cooling. I know it's not necessarily a need, quote unquote, but if you're going to be doing anything with it, spend the extra $10, $15, $20 to get the official case, get the active cooler, or get third-party stuff, because it's going to help with thermal throttling and overall temperatures and just get the best performance out of it. Speaking of performance, I was able to overclock my Raspberry Pi 5. If you've never overclocked a Pi before, it's super, super simple. You literally just change a text file in the SD card that has your OS. I tweaked mine from 2.4 gigahertz to 2.8. That seemed to be the sweet spot for me. I've seen people push it further to 3. I had issues with that. So again, there's kind of like a little silicon lottery going on there. But 2.8 gigahertz, getting an extra 400 megahertz of performance without really jeopardizing the hardware. It's been running fine for me. You can even overclock the GPU. I kept mine at the stock 800 megahertz, but again, there has been people who've kind of pushed that to its limits. With that, I would also just recommend, like I mentioned earlier, getting the official power supply to get the full potential out of the Pi 5. If you're going to be hooking up all sorts of I/O to this, taking advantage of those new USB 3.0 ports, you might as well get the official power supply to really get the full potential out of that. And then with that, I also just got to test out a bunch of other things. Like I said, like emulation. I got more emulators running on it. I got Dreamcast emulators running it, GameCube emulators running on it. I've seen videos of other people pushing things like PS2 and Yuzu emulators. So a lot of emulation in games and things that didn't run smoothly or run at all on the Pi 4. A lot of people have been able to achieve that with a new hardware on the Pi 5. So that's something I'm really excited for, because the sole reason I picked up this Pi 5 is because I'm going to be throwing it in my arcade 1-up cabinet to serve as a mod and host a lot of that emulation on my arcade machine. So again, it's the benefit of having something that's so small, form factor, power efficient and whatnot, yet super powerful, which the Pi 5 is. So all of that in mind, I'm really excited with my pickup. I'm actually looking forward to picking up a couple more of these in the future for other projects. Again, the potential here is really just scratching the surface. So if there's questions that you have about the Pi 5 or that you want to see in future content, drop it down in the comments below. Consider subscribing for more content like this in the future. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up and like button. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up my initial thoughts and look at the Raspberry Pi 5. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.